Your whole life is just a dream.
I am immortal.
I think you've been afraid all your life. Now, open your mind to me.
It's a dream.
You have always been here.
It's a dream.
Happy heresies, my beloved truth seekers. Yes, I like it a lot better than the stupid good tidings I've been using since episode 1. Let me know if you like it better. Anywho, this is Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria and formerly through freethoughtmedia.com. These days it's Stickum on my homepage, thegodabovegod.com. This is where Simon Magus and Helen of Troy guard over us to ensure we live our own myth and write our own gospels like the ancient Gnostics. This is where Hypatia, the last scholar of the Library of Alexandria, will make it home before being killed by the Christian mob and ushering the real Genesis to the Dark Ages.
This is supposed to be a happy occasion. Let's not bicker and argue about who killed who.
This is where we attempt to access the underground stream of Gnosis by cracking the stone layers of orthodoxy. I humbly and gratefully welcome you aboard this dark odyssey with Abraxas on this approximately August 18, 2007. We are the veterans of 1,000 psychic wars, and we are setting the controls for the heart of the sun. Together we stand, divided we rise. Or perhaps we should begin standing together. After all, it was Benjamin Franklin who said, "Gentlemen, if we do not hang together, surely we will hang separately." And you just know one day they will come after us. Yaldabaoth, the cosmic and personal ego, and his angelic mafia aren't just going to sit around and allow humanity to even entertain peace and egalitarianism.
It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop. Ever!
So our goal remains the same. As Clement of Alexandria wrote, the greatest lesson is to know yourself, because when you know yourself, you will know God. And part of knowing yourself is peeling away all the spackle layers that the powers and principalities placed over your spirit until you forgot you mattered to the divine plan of redeeming the universe.
God isn't interested in technology. He knows nothing of the potential of the microchip or the silicon revolution. Look how he spends his time. 43 species of parrots. Nipples for men.
You bought into the mirage of careers, social circles, lifelong loves, meaningful families, and sooner or later you realized that disappointment was all it would lead to unless you became detached, disengaged from all that was temporal in the madhouse that is reality.
Do you ever get tired of watching bad things happen to people?
But now you are here, and now I welcome you as a pantheon of gods in the making. On this program, we venture eastward to understand one of the distant cousins of Gnosticism, Zen Buddhism. Our guest is Brad Warner, author of Hardcore Zen and Sit Down and Shut Up. Both great manuals on Zen because Brad, as a former punk rocker, speaks in a very approachable a la mode manner. You won't get lost, both in the interview and in his books, in all the rather weird jargon of Buddhism. You won't have to deal too much with endless koans, when all you want to do is to gain a good grasp of this practical yet mystical tradition. And after the interview, we'll have on my spiritual brother, Nate Merritt, author of Jehovah Unmasked and I Was a Teenage Jehovah Witness, who will furnish us with the similarities and differences between Zen Buddhism and Gnosticism.
Behold, I send you out as sheep amidst the wolves.
If you really want a comprehensive comparison between Gnosticism and the more traditional Buddhism, I suggest you download Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis number 8, Crouching Buddha, Hidden Jesus, with Tom Raglan. You might end up soiling yourself mentally at the very striking parallels between the two. We even find connections between Buddhism and both Judaism and mainstream Christianity. That's really not a stretch for you more rational-minded people, since it's known that there were Buddhist monks in Alexandria as far back as 200 BC. And no matter what the Orthodox tell you, there is always cross-pollination between any religions that come into contact.
I love humans. All the same patterns and things that aren't there.
I, in my mortal incarnation, was a Mahayana Buddhist for about a year. It was a great experience that marshaled tributaries of Gnosis in my then just getting over drug state.
You're a very bad man.
But eventually I found Gnosticism to be a better fit. After all, instead of learning all these naughty names, terms, and definitions, having to basically immerse myself in another culture, all I had to do was return to the familiar clothing of Christianity in order to find spiritual freedom. I already knew from my days of orthodoxy Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Paul, and Peter. I knew the crime scenes of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and the Roman Empire. But Gnosticism taught me to view them as archetypal characters and places of the inner theater of my soul. The tragic play of the Christ took the context of an internal salvation and an awareness of my divine inheritance. It was familiar but exotic at the same time. The names, places, and dates were changed for idiots like me who didn't want to learn, but the destination was the same.
I am the god of hellfire!
I still hold on to many Buddhist practices, the most important one being meditation, and I highly extol it because, let's face it, in this world where Gnostics are the minority of minorities, services, rituals, and heretical secrets are just hard to come by.
I work for Kaiser Soze.
Furthermore, finding what works for you, what is your metaphysical fit, also takes time, so meditation is a groovy and no-charge tool to empty yourself, clean your inner sanctum, and align yourself to the axis mundi that leads to the pleroma. And if anything, it will cut down on your stress and keep you away from the damn television and internet for a while.
You see, we're on a mission from God.
So luckily for you, that is pretty much all my drivel. The suffering ends as we grab a flight to the Orient with Brad Warner and get our higher minds around the mystery of Zen Buddhism. This is the Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis interview. With us we have Brad Warner, author of a book I really love the title, Sit Down and Shut Up. How you doing today, Brad?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. How's California?
It's all right. You know, always sunny and warm. But I'm from Ohio, so you know this whole sunny and warm thing kind of gets on my nerves after a while. You know?
Yeah, I understand. I like the summer, but sometimes I look forward to winter.
Yeah.
Could you give us a brief account on your evolution from punk rocker to Zen teacher?
Okay, the brief version. In the early 80s, I was in a band called Zero Defects, who was the hardest hardcore band in Akron, Ohio, and we played with the Meat Puppets and Misfits and DRI and all these, you know, whoever would come through, MDC a whole bunch of times, all these bands that went on to become kind of big deals among the hardcore scene. And at the same time, I had been interested since childhood in Eastern religions and such. I grew up partly in Nairobi, Kenya, in Africa, and there's a huge Indian population there. It got exposed at an early age to these Indian ideas. So when I got back to Ohio and was in the hardcore scene, I was also looking for something to study about that, and kind of just by chance, stumbled upon Zen Buddhism. I was looking for something at Kent State University to study, and I wanted something about Indian religion, and the closest thing I could find was a class called Zen Buddhism, which I wasn't really interested in, but Buddhism was basically from India, so I thought, well, that's close enough to start with. And when I got there, I found that the philosophy, the teacher there was a guy named Tim McCarthy. The philosophy he was talking about was very, very practical and very direct. And in a lot of ways, it reminded me of just what I've been trying to get to in the punk scene, which was to get to something more real or more direct or more natural and expressive than what you would find in rock music at the time in the early 80s, which sucked. So I was trying to find that, and eventually punk sort of turned sour for me in the mid-'80s when it got to be too violent and too trendy, although it wasn't nearly as trendy as it is now. And I got out of it and continued to follow the Buddhist way, and it took a few years to kind of realize the connection between the two, because probably in my mind at the time I was kind of rejecting punk, to do this thing, and it didn't kind of dawn on me until a while later that it was more or less a continuation of the same path. Because of that, I ended up writing this book called Hardcore Zen, in which I sort of laid out how that had come about and why I thought the two were similar or compatible with each other.
Could you tell us what the origins of Zen Buddhism is?
Well, the origins of Zen Buddhism, if you want to go back to historically speaking, this is all kind of points of contention among different Buddhist sects. The Zen lineage looks at itself as an unbroken continuation from the time of Buddha through a specific line of his followers and their followers and so on and so forth down the line. But most historians looking at that will tell you that as far as a matter of history, we can't really depend on that version of events. And what it is, as far as historians are concerned, is more a kind of a back to basics movement within Buddhism that started more or less in China. It was probably brought to China by Indian Buddhists, but it really didn't take off until it got to China, where people were trying to find out what was the core of this Buddhist stuff when you strip away a lot of the more ritualistic and ceremonial and legendary and mystical elements of it and get right down to the actual practice, which is Zazen, which is this sort of meditation practice. So what Zen does is strips away almost everything that had grown up around Buddhism after the time of Buddha's death. Because if you actually go back to Buddha himself, you find that he's a very back-to-basics guy, and that a lot of this stuff that got stuck on top of his philosophy wasn't there to begin with. So that's more or less the in a nutshell the origin of the Zen line of Buddhism.
But aren't there many schools of Zen Buddhism? It's most people think it's just monolithic.
Well, there's many schools of Buddhism. Within the Zen tradition, there are really only three major lines, which is Rinzai and Soto and Obaku. But Obaku is very, very small and is very, very similar to Rinzai, so a lot of people sort of ignore it, poor guys. But the tradition I come from, it happens to be the Soto line, which what makes them kind of unique among Zen is the idea that Zazen, this meditative practice I talked about, is enlightenment itself. There's this idea of enlightenment within Zen and within Buddhism in general, which a lot of people are familiar with. The idea among a lot of Buddhists is that you do your meditation practice in order to reach enlightenment, and the Soto way of thinking is no, you don't do it to reach enlightenment. The practice is enlightenment, which is an odd way of looking at things, because if you've ever done the practice, it certainly doesn't usually feel like enlightenment. It feels boring or painful or just kind of pointless sometimes. But it's this process of keeping continuously going into this practice that is enlightenment.
Does that shock a lot of New Agers and other Buddhists when you tell them that?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's definitely not the point of view that the New Age movement likes to espouse, because it's when I get exposed to that from time to time, I can see that it's very fantasy prone. It's something that's trying to escape from this world and from reality into another place, into a better place. But the Buddhist way of looking at things, or the Zen way of looking at things, is that there is no better place. There's only this, which is difficult for people to take, because we tend to look at our own lives and think, well, there's got to be something better than this. It's
right.
Whatever it is, you want something better, and it's hard to stay with it and see it for what it really is. But if you continuously stay with your life, you can find that it's really what you want It's where you want to be, even if you don't recognize it as such. This is a kind of a odd way of looking at things, I think.
Yeah, personally, Brad, I do practice, because I told you about my friend, I do practice Zen Buddhist meditation. And in your book, you say you have to do it that way. But let's say somebody like me who has a bad lower back and I have to kind of lean on the wall and all that, am I just wasting my time, or is there a little room to maneuver here?
There is room to maneuver. I tend to be, I err on the side of saying, no, you got to do it just like this, because I see a lot of people who can do the practice in the correct way, who just will be like, oh, my toe hurts a little bit today, and then they'll be sitting on a chair or something like that. And really, that's the best way to do it. But of course, there's no restrictions, and there's no like, you've only got one leg, so you can't possibly do Zazen or something like that. That would be ridiculous. But really, for people who are healthy and able to do it in the proper way, it's tremendously beneficial. So I tend to be probably a bit too hardcore about doing it in the proper way, just because I think if you can, you should. But if you can't, you can find another way that'll work for you.
And Zazen is basically the keynote of Zen Buddhism. Everything else is just a footnote.
Yeah, and that goes back to Buddha's time. That's kind of one of the things that was, I think, forgotten by a lot of the people who came along later, which the Zen people rediscovered more or less, was that, but really at the core of what he was saying and doing was teaching people how to do this seated meditation practice, and all these ceremonial things and prayers and chants and the list goes on and on that had been added to it really didn't have much to do with what was at the core of what he was talking about.
What happens, because sometimes one of the things that are leveled against Zen Buddhists is because there's no belief in the self or consciousness or soul, is that they are very nihilistic. What do you say to them?
It's not nihilistic at all, but that's because if you think about it and say, well, what's the alternative to having a self or soul, then sometimes your mind can only come up with this nihilistic idea as an alternative to that, because you don't know what else to look for. But what we're aiming at is something that doesn't have anything to do with thought. So it's nothing that what's really there is something that thought can't possibly grasp. I mean, there's even stuff in Dogen, who's a real proponent of the Soto line, the guy who wrote the book about, who says something similar to the self or something similar to the soul. He'll drop that line in occasionally. So it may have aspects that are similar to this idea of soul or self or consciousness, but it's not that, because once you have said self or soul or consciousness, you put it in a box and said, I understand what this is, and now I can put this box over here and get on with my life. But you haven't really understood it. It's still something very mysterious that has aspects that you can't possibly encompass in your brain, no matter how hard you try.
And you mentioned Dogen. What made you interested about him, and could you tell us a little about this old Zen master?
Well, Dogen was a guy who, he was a 13th century Zen Buddhist monk and writer, and the real interesting thing about him to me is that he wrote so much. There were a lot of Zen masters and a lot of teachers, but when you read even the ancient texts, including stuff about Buddha never wrote anything. In fact, I don't really believe this, but there's a school of thought that said Buddha might have been illiterate, but he was a prince, and I think he probably knew how to read and write.
Right.
But anyway, he never actually wrote anything. Just his followers wrote down or memorized what he said, and this has happened over and over in the course of Buddhist history, that there are a lot of the words of great masters are available to us, but most of them are third-hand accounts like that, second-hand maybe. In Dogen's case, he wrote a lot, and he left this huge body of work, the biggest thing being Shopo Genzo, but there were several other very large books. And the guy died when he was 54, so he must have been just writing constantly in order to produce all this work. So that's very interesting. And also the way he puts things is he tries to put things into words that really can't possibly be put into words. And so in one sense he's going to fail because he can't possibly succeed. But in order to try to convey some of these ideas, he kind of reinvents language. And also he's really into puns, which, I can appreciate because I like puns. But so he has this unique way of trying to explain things that nobody else really has done since.
Did you say that his writings were basically forgotten for centuries?
Yeah, and that's another interesting aspect because his the group that he started thrived after his death and went on to become, I think, if not the largest, one of the largest Buddhist organizations in Japan, even during the Middle Ages, or not Middle Ages, but anyway, even after his death. But the things he actually wrote were kind of circulated among the inner circle of monks who ran the organization, but they didn't really go much further than that until the 1600s, which to us seems like a long time ago, but you think about that, that's 400 years after he wrote them.
Right.
So they finally started to be circulated. And even that edition went out of print very quickly and wasn't printed again until 200 more years later. And it really wasn't until the 20th century that his works were actually widely distributed and popularized, even in Japan. So this was a guy who, and subsequently they've become pretty popular, which is interesting because I think it says a lot for him having been really, really ahead of his time. I think he was getting into areas of, psychology and philosophy and even to some extent physics and things like that people weren't ready for in his time, that they might be ready for now.
What I like about your book, or one part of your book, is you talk about how Zen masters have very intense personalities despite their higher state of consciousness. Yeah. How exactly does this happen?
Yeah, it's a lot of people kind of hear these ideas we put out in Zen, for example, transcending your emotions and kind of establishing this sort of evenness, and imagine that the result of doing that would be you'd turn into a robot, or at best you'd turn into something like Mr. Spock from Star Trek. But the real fact of the matter is when you actually encounter people who spent a good portion of their lives studying and following this practice, they're not like that at all. Neither of my main teachers were like that. None of the people I ever read about or encountered on a casual basis were ever like that either. So there's a line in Dogen where he says, it's not that realization breaks the individual self any more than the reflection of the sky will break a drop of water. The whole sky can be reflected in a dewdrop on a leaf of a blade of grass, I think is what he says. So there is this idea that we all have personalities, and personalities are a useful way to communicate and to interact with other people. And there's no reason to just chuck that away and try to be something you're not. Still have that, and sometimes it can be seen even more intense or pronounced than it was before, even though you've kind of established a way of no longer believing in your personality, or at least you don't believe in it as a permanent sort of self that's going to last forever.
Yeah, that makes sense, because when you watch like old Jackie Chan movies or Kill Bill 2, you always wonder, why is the teacher such a jerk, or whatever,
Yeah. Yeah, and then most of them are, well, not being jerks, but there's a kind of sense that and it's one of the hard parts of the job that I've discovered is that you have to kind of take that stance sometimes with a student or somebody who's coming. I don't even think of people as students. They just, the people who practice with me. But sometimes you have to set somebody straight in a very forceful way because it's necessary as part of that relationship. And it's always a little hard because you I don't know, if you're like me, you just want to wimp out and go, okay, whatever, you know. But sometimes you need to do that.
Have you ever watched Fight Club?
I've never seen Fight Club. People ask me that a lot. I should go rent it because this is not the first time I've been asked about it, but I've never seen it.
Yeah, because there's one scene which a lot of Zen Buddhists tell me about where they're all standing outside and the teacher walks out and says, I have nothing to teach you, and then he walks in and then he walks out and starts hitting them. Is that like what happens in Zen Buddhism a lot?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably derived from some of the traditional stories, because, for example, there's no sense of trying to evangelize about Buddhism or try to convert people to Zen, because there's no point in it. And what they do, traditionally at least, has been just the opposite. You have to go to a temple if you want to enter the temple, and you have to sit there out on the steps in the rain and the snow and knocking on the door, and they won't let you in until you've proved that you really, really mean it, that you're not just wasting their time and yours on some kind of a fantasy, that you really want to be part of this and you really want to understand it and learn it. And so there is that sense. I mean, I don't make people wait outside my apartment, for 3 days trying to talk to me. But on the other hand, I don't, when people ask me about Buddhism and when I get to do interviews and stuff, I'm very happy to talk about it. But at the same point, I'm not going to try to convert anybody. And if you don't want to listen, then that's fine. Just go, because it doesn't do me any particular good to have people around me who aren't sincere and who aren't really, really interested in the practice. That just gets in the way. So if you're serious about it, I'll do whatever it takes to try to help you. But if you're not serious about it, I don't really, I mean, it's sort of sad, but what am I going to do about it?
Right. How does Zen Buddhism deal with the problem of evil or iniquity?
Well, evil is, there's a thing I wrote in the book, Evil is Stupid, was my chapter on that. There really isn't this idea of evil as this kind of immutable substance that exists in the universe in the way we normally tend to think of it in Western philosophy. There is right action and wrong action, and moment by moment you can always see, this is one of the hard ideas in Buddhism, which says you can always, and this goes for anybody, you can always see what action you ought to take in any given circumstance, but you have a very, very powerful brain and a very, very powerful ego that will come in there and start shouting all kinds of alternatives to that action, and if you're not able to quiet that down, you can get lost in that confusion until you cannot separate all this noise that your brain and your ego is throwing up from the smaller voice that is telling you exactly what you need to do, this sort of intuitive sense. And so what we call evil is just going against that intuitive sense and doing something that either serves yourself or that you think is going to be for the greater good. So many evil things are done for the greater good. You get lost in that, and it's really about seeing what's necessary at the moment. And this includes even the smallest things you do. It's like how you dust the shelves, or how you clean the toilet, or how you take the change from the person at the grocery store. These things are all, in Buddhist terms, moral action that you have to pay attention to. And we tend to separate more morality into the big things, whether you actually kill your boss or just, poison him mildly without killing him. These are moral decisions, but how you put on your shoes, this is just completely irrelevant. And so the Buddhist take on that is everything you do has that aspect of right action or going against right action. And when you find that you've gone against right action, all you can do is just try to make the next action as right as possible. So there's no sense in regretting it or beating yourself up over it. You just have to go back and get back on track each time. And in that sense, you can more or less forget, maybe not forget, but it doesn't do any good to try to dwell on what you've done wrong. There's a precept in Buddhism, no speaking of past mistakes. So you don't speak of your past mistakes. You just keep going on trying to do the right thing now.
Dovetailing into this, the Buddhists really don't have a concept of sin. I think the only sin you mention in the book is wasting your time.
Yeah, there isn't that idea, and that was kind of shocking to me to live, for 11 years in a. You can say Japan is a Buddhist country, although a lot of Japanese people don't know dip about Buddhism. There's still this strong influence from Buddhist philosophy, and including this idea that they don't really even understand. There's a word, I think hiji, or I think it's the word. But anyway, there's a word that's the translation for sin. But when I hear Japanese people use it, I notice they don't mean the same thing at all, and they don't really get the idea. So there isn't this idea that there are these actions you take against God. There's this, but there is still right action. So it's a very difficult idea to grasp if you are steeped in the sort of Christian idea of sin.
An interesting, another zinger you throw at us is you talk about how the pursuit of happiness is futile in Zen Buddhism.
Well, yeah, actually that title was taken, I have this thing called Futile Pursuit of Happiness, which was taken from an article I read, which is called The Futile Pursuit of Happiness. And it's the idea that we always have this notion of what will make us happy, and we go for that and try to avoid things that won't make us happy. But in real experience, most of our ideas of what will make us happy and what will make us miserable are wrong. And these researchers who'd written this article, or about whom this article was written, found in their research that this was really often the case, that the things you thought were going to make you ecstatically happy don't. And even the things you thought were going to be devastatingly sad don't make you that sad either. Because we're always going for a state of equilibrium, and sadness and happiness are outside of that equilibrium. Which isn't to say that it isn't a kind of happiness to reach that state of equilibrium. That's where the real happiness is, but it's not this kind of giddy high that we think of or we associate with happiness. It's not like the woohoo kind of happiness. It's more, but it's more in its own way. It's more intense than that because it's so happy that you can't even muster up the woohoo. You just it's just things are as they are, and that's incredible. And you just spend your life just being amazed at how incredible it is that you're just here doing this. Picking this lint out of your belly button, whatever it happens to be, it's this kind of magical thing that we miss often. So that the idea of pursuing something, being rich or famous or whatever it is you pursue that's going to make you happy, is kind of a mistake. And it's better to just stay with what is and see that for what it is and deal with it.
And why is, Brad, reincarnation barely talked about in Zen Buddhism, unlike other forms of Buddhism?
Well, Dogen's take on he has a whole thing where he lambasts the idea of reincarnation as not being a Buddhist idea. He goes through it, and it's funny when you read this. When you first read this, you think he's telling you this is the way things are, and he'll go through a very detailed description of the reincarnation process. And after he's gone through about a paragraph and a half of that, he goes, "This idea is completely non-Buddhism." So he was very against that idea. I think I think a lot of the mythology about reincarnation comes from things, more ancient beliefs that weren't part of Buddhism, creeping in and creeping back into Buddhism. But the point isn't whether we reincarnate or not, or what happens after we die. The point is you don't know what happens after you die. And furthermore, in Buddhist terminology, you are dying all the time, because we say the universe is being born and being destroyed at every moment. And there's one bit of Dogen where he delineates the number of moments there are in a day, and it's like 6,400,198 or something like that. You know, but meaning the universe is the idea of time in Buddhism is that the universe is sort of born and destroyed over and over and over and over. But at the same time, running through it is this present moment, because every one of these moments, born and destroyed as they are, is always the present, and that's a bit mystical, because it's one thing and it's the other, depending on which side of the coin you look at. So what happens after you die is missing the point. You're imagining that there's going to be some time in the future in which you die, and at which point you're going to go to the gates and see St. Peter, or you're going to be reincarnated as a fish, or whatever it is. And in getting absorbed in those ideas, you're missing your real life as it unfolds before you by just dwelling in some kind of a fantasy about the future. And the point isn't whether or not that happens. Who knows? But it's outside of it's one of the things that's outside of our scope of understanding. But at the same time, when you discover that each moment is the universe, to paraphrase Dogen, that's also a much bigger thing than the idea of reincarnation allows for, which is just this idea that you move from body to body and have all these cool adventures. But it may be something much bigger than that.
And you also mentioned in your book that faith and doubt are very important in mastering Zen Buddhism.
Yeah, both. That was my teacher's teacher, Koben Chino. I think he's the one who coined the line that you need an equal amount of doubt and faith. And so faith keeps you going and keeps you practicing. And doubt keeps you from going off the deep end with your practice. I mean, it takes a certain amount of faith to keep doing this Zazen practice day after day after day and not really getting anywhere. And so you have to have a kind of a faith that it is important and that it is valuable. But at the same time, if you don't doubt that faith, then you can go off in the wrong direction of getting a bit too excited about it, getting confused in that direction. I always hated Zazen when I first began it, and when I would see people who were really, really gung-ho and excited about it, that kind of scared me, because like, dude, this is just, you're just sitting there looking at the wall, just stop it. At the same time, there is a kind of a depth to the practice that you're not going to find anywhere else, and that's important as well. So you need kind of both sides, a kind of balance.
Oh, I agree. Sometimes doing my meditation is what I most look forward to the day and what I least most look forward to the day.
Yeah.
It's kind of a two-edged sword.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing it for like 25 years or something now, and there's still days when I get up and it's like, oh, God. But most of the time it's not like that. Most of the time I want to do it. So that the days I used to have of trying to come up with a good excuse to avoid it that doesn't come up so much anymore.
Another what might be shocking to some, because people consider Buddhism agnostic or atheistic, is that you mentioned that you believe in God. How do you define God?
Well, I like my own teacher's words, which is God is the universe and the universe is God. So I don't believe there's a God outside the universe. It's like this summer I was at this book fair, and the representatives of a certain religion, I probably shouldn't name because I don't want to be suicide bombed, were passing out pamphlets about their religion, and one of the things in there was about life after death, and it said, God tallies up all the right and wrong things you've done since the onset of puberty. And I thought, that's nice of God. He doesn't count any of the stuff you did before you sprouted hair down there.
No kidding.
And, and he just kind of lets you off the hook for that. But in Buddhism, we don't have this idea that there is a God out there who can kind of give you exemptions. So you're always fully responsible for everything you do under any circumstances. It's cause and effect. It's like if you stick your hand on a hot stove, you're going to get burned, no matter whether God tries to grant you an exemption to that rule or not. It's always going to happen. So this cause and effect plays into it. But at the same time, it's not as if cause and effect is some kind of cold, mechanistic thing. It's something in a very deep and kind of hard to explain way. It's something that you are participating in ways you may not be aware of. So there's an intelligence to it. I don't want to say that because it seems too, you're getting back into the idea of intelligence, and people think, well, you mean there's somebody thinking about it and deciding what effect to give you for your cause? And it's not like that. But it's as if the intelligence part of you is also participating in this cause and effect relationship between you and the rest of the universe. And in that sense, the entire universe is more powerful than any God you could create in your mind, who could grant you exemptions and who could have magic powers to part the seas and whatever, turn loaves into fishes or whatever it is he's supposed to do. It's something more powerful than that. And so, yeah, I don't reject the idea of God, but then I have the somewhat advantageous background of having not had any religion as a kid to rebel against. So sometimes you see people who come into Buddhism in particular who are rebelling against their religion. And I can see the need among people like that to really kick out God from the picture, but I never really had to. And the only idea of God I ever encountered was this idea of the universe is God, and so I can accept that. But the idea of this, a white guy with a beard sitting on the throne, smiting his enemies and rewarding his friends, is obviously ridiculous.
I don't know if you said it or you quote it, but there's you mentioned in your book, God doesn't exist, but He created you.
Yeah, that's somebody. I think it might have been Joshu Sasaki or some Zen guy had said there is no God and He is your creator, which sounds like messing around with words, but it's actually an attempt to say something more meaningful about God than the usual way we think of as God. So there isn't any God in the sense of what you think of as God, but yet in another sense, you're not your own creation in the way you think of yourself as you might think of yourself as being your own creation. There's a whole universe out there which gave birth to you and to which you are obliged to contribute back to. And there's this kind of reciprocal relationship between you and the universe that's similar in some ways to the old-fashioned concept of God.
So the end game, or what I'm saying of Buddhism, and reminds me of Gnosticism, is to realize there is no distinction, that all is one and one is all.
At the same time, realizing that no distinction, you also have to realize that there is distinction. So Buddhism doesn't throw away the other side of it. So it's not enough just to realize there's no distinction. If you look at one of these traditional things, which is actually a Rinzai thing, but this idea of there's the ox herding pictures, but there's a set of pictures which shows somebody's development as a Buddhist monk, and in the first one he's an ox herder, and he goes through all these different stages until there's this stage where the picture is just a circle with nothing in it. So he's completely disappeared, and he's completely become one with the universe. But it doesn't stop there. There's like 4 more pictures after that where he gradually comes back, and in the last picture he's an ox herder again. So there's this idea of, there is this fundamental oneness to the universe, but it's not enough to just stop with that. You have to understand how the separation also relates to that. It's not as if the two are really different.
So it all comes down to balance.
Yeah, well, balance is a very, very important part of Zen practice, yeah.
Well, I think, Brad, that's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank you very much for taking your time and coming on Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it was my pleasure, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
And there you have it, my beloved True Seekers. Brad Warner, author of Hardcore Zen and Sit Down and Shut Up, love the title, with a very approachable, yet at the same time scopic tutorial on Zen Buddhism. I'm sure many of you already noticed similarities and differences between Zen and Gnosticism. Personally, Gnosticism is my poison, but whatever works for you works for you. Nothing makes me happier than watching the cosmic suffering of an individual evaporate just a little bit more, regardless of the path. In the end, anyone who is part of the esoteric side of any religion, anyone who has experienced the rushing power of light and darkness of the multiverse, and anyone who has understood to a point what cannot be understood is a Gnostic at heart. But to further understand Zen Buddhism and its philosophical blood ties to Gnosticism, as I mentioned before, we have a mini interview with Nate Merritt, author of Jehovah Unmasked and I Was a Teenage Jehovah Witness. With those titles, you wonder if he would know anything about Buddhism. But Nate was a Zen teacher for decades and still is one for all practical purposes. He writes a weekly article for Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, so while you're listening to the show, feel free to read his words. They are great for anyone who might be having spiritual constipation. He kicks you in the second set of orthodox testicles we all still have. At the same time, he nudges you towards the truth of various religions and dogmas. And he certainly knows how to allow Sophia to enter his message. Plato said all learning is remembering. The Buddha didn't become enlightened under the Bodhi tree. No, he realized he had been enlightened the entire time. So enjoy our second stab at Zen Buddhism and accept that what you hear you already knew deep in the depths of your subconscious before they were buried under the compost heap of the God of this world. Now we move on to Nathaniel Merritt, author of Jehovah Unmasked and I Was a Teenage Jehovah Witness. How you doing today, Nate?
Really good today. How about you, Miguel?
Good, good. Can't complain.
Excellent.
So
well, you can, but it's not going to do a lot good. So.
Yeah, nobody's going to listen as usual. But now that we've talked to Brad and he's given us a wonderful interview, let's kind of move on to your perspective on Zen Buddhism and how it ties into Gnosticism and so forth. So for starters, why don't you tell us a little bit how you got involved in Zen Buddhism?
Well, I first got involved in meditation, transcendental meditation, age 20. That wasn't long after I was born again in the Jesus movement, and I did that for several years. And then I switched to Siddha meditation for several years, went through the Shaktipat ritual with a Shakti master. Finally, I settled on Zazen, which that's a regionalism. Back east in Michigan, where I come from, they say Zazen. Out here they say Zazen. So Zazen, I got involved in Zazen. So I've been doing Zazen for about 28 years. I did it the entire time I was a born-again Christian, though I didn't let any of my other Christian friends know it, except my wife, because, you know, it's of the devil, don't you know? So,
of course.
When I dumped Christianity, I immediately gravitated toward Buddhism because I'd been doing a form of Buddhist meditation for many years. So it seemed natural. And my first exposure to Buddhism as a system of thought was Theravada Buddhism. Theravada is the oldest form of Buddhism. I learned it very rapidly, but I got tired of it really quickly because of all the jargon. It's extremely technical. Well, all forms of Buddhism are except Zen. Since I was already doing Zen meditation, I began to check out Zen, and that's when I met Master Shannon Teisho online. He eventually ordained me as a priest, And then he and I and several other priests formed the Hangaku Jodo sect of Pure Land Buddhism, but I continued to practice Zen in my personal life.
And what, in a few words, what would you say is the definition of Zen Buddhism and what it entails?
Oh, man.
Is that too loaded question?
Well, yeah, it's a multifaceted diamond. I'll tell you exactly what I tell everybody else who asks me that question, what is Zen? I say, Zen is much ado about no thing.
That's it, huh?
And anybody who knows a little about Zen will get the joke. Zen's a lot of things. It began as a path for intellectual Buddhists who knew that their intellectualism wasn't taking them anywhere. Zen is about the here and now, this moment, and being completely present in it. Even if you've just been fired from your job and your wife just left you and the IRS is auditing you and a pit bull is chewing your foot off, it's about being right here in this moment, right now, not in the future, not in your mind wandering all over the place. It's right here and now. In Zazen, you learn to focus so intently on your breath that you lose all awareness of yourself. There's only breathing. Then you carry that one-pointedness over to the practice of mindfulness in your entire life, so that when you're doing dishes, there's only dishes being done. There's no self there. When you're mowing lawn, there's just lawn being mown. This is a lifetime practice. It isn't something you master by reading a book or a billion books. I haven't mastered it yet. It's a daily practice. Zen is also about breaking down your cultural conditioning, seeing the world and the universe as suchness, seeing it as it actually is, without all the cultural baggage and mental conditioning that we've been brought up, without projecting any of that onto the world, onto the cosmos. It's about going with the flow of your inner being, which is actually the entire universe. You learn to be in sync with nature, with the entire cosmos. No, I'm not exhausted what Zen is by these statements, but hopefully that gives the listeners at least an idea. If I communicate nothing else, I want to communicate that Zen isn't books and lectures. Zen's a way of being. It's not a head trip. A lot of Gnostics I've met have turned Gnosis into a head trip. Zen is as much Taoism as it is Buddhism because it's a synthesis of the two.
Do Zen Buddhists view Buddha as a historical figure, or as you do, you view him as a mythological / sun god?
Yes, I view Buddha definitely as a mythological being, a sun god. That would depend on what school of Buddhist thought you're encountering. To a Theravadan, which means way of the elders, the idea that Gautama is a mythical being, that'd be the equivalent of blasphemy. I mean, that'd be like telling a fundamentalist Christian that Jesus didn't exist. I mean, it's unthinkable to them. They wouldn't even entertain the thought. You're likely to find openness and acceptance of Buddha as a myth among Mahayana Buddhists of whatever Dharma gate, and especially among Vajrayana Buddhists or the Tibetan Buddhists. Online, I've talked with a lot of Vajrayana Buddhists, and their attitude is, of course the Buddha is a myth. What, is there something the matter with your brain?
Right.
So that's their attitude. Among Zen Buddhists, I find more of a what does it matter either way kind of attitude. It depends on the school of thought and the individual, but speaking in generalities, that's the way it would go.
And Nate, you were a Zen Buddhist for quite a while, but it seems you moved or evolved towards Christian esotericism / Gnosticism. Why did you do that?
Well, first of all, Christianity is my cultural heritage. I never felt that the cultural trappings of the East fit me very well. My oldest sister, Jackie, and I, we became really involved in researching our genealogy a few years back, and we began to feel really connected to our ancestors and to our own cultural roots. She's a metaphysical Christian. Our family is Catholic on both sides. In fact, I have an ancestor who's a canonized Catholic saint, St. John Twing. He's the patron saint of women in labor. We got into our genealogy, learned about all these people, and so it was natural to us to gravitate to the mythos of our own culture. But there's no way I could return to it in any sort of literalist fashion. I'd had it with literalism, with fundamentalism. I've still had it with literalism. I met a Gnostic intellectual named Brian, and we had a series of really intense episodes of face-to-face Dharma combat, and I mean Dharma combat, which he eventually won. I hate to admit, but I became really open to Gnostic Christianity because of him and the Gnostic vision of the Christos. I saw this form of Christianity as a way of not simply returning to my cultural roots, but as perhaps a more effective way of interesting people in spiritual practice, people who might otherwise be put off by foreign cultural trappings like of Buddhism. Gnosticism was familiar, but it was exotic simultaneously.
What are some of the similarities between Zen Buddhism and Gnosticism?
In theory, anyway, they're both an experiential knowing of reality. In practice, you'll find a lot of so-called Zen Buddhists who wouldn't know a zafu from a snafu. Their Zen comes from books, so they stink of Zen, as the saying goes. I think the same is true with a lot of Gnostics. They read books about Gnosticism, they mull it over, and they think that's Gnosis. And you'll meet a lot of Zen Buddhists who do the same thing. Yet at core, that's not what they're supposed to be. Zen especially is not about books and philosophizing. I know that Gnosticism has a strong philosophical streak, but not in Zen. Gnostics call this world the Kenoma, which means emptiness, right? Mm-hmm. The emptiness, the Kenoma. Well, that corresponds really strongly with the Zen teaching of Shunyata, which also means emptiness, the void. Both see this universe as void, as emptiness, but both have a very different solution to the problem. Those are the similarities I see.
And what are some of the more striking differences between Zen Buddhism and Gnosticism?
Well, right off, Gnosticism is a much more direct, it's much more direct in a left hemisphere sort of way. They're both direct, but Zen is direct in a way that humans aren't accustomed to, such as in answering the question, what is the Buddha, by responding 3 pounds of flax. Zen's very direct, but not in a left hemisphere sort of way, not in a left hemisphere directness, but in a very right hemisphere directness, because we humans really don't use our right hemisphere very much. That's where our mystical sense and things like that originate. And Zen tries to awaken that. Humans, we're way too far into our left hemisphere because we're such verbally controlled critters. Zen seeks to overcome that and bring about a balance between the two hemispheres in our mind, a whole brain functioning. In Gnosticism, it seems to me that there's more of a willingness to verbalize insight or truth, more of a reliance on the left hemisphere, more of a reliance on words. The mysteriousness of Gnosticism is very different from the mysteriousness of Zen. Zen's about the here and now, this very moment, finding transcendence in the most ordinary and mundane of acts, such as sawing wood and carrying wire or scraping gum off the carpet. Historically, anyway, Gnosis is about transcending the ordinary completely and eventually escaping samsara or the Kenoma entirely. In Zen, on the other hand, you embrace samsara and seek to escape samsara by realizing that you are samsara and thereby losing the illusion of self. That's an oversimplification, and there's more overlap between the two than I've let on. That's the best I can do in a soundbite fashion. There aren't any sacraments in Zen like there are in various forms of Gnosticism. Everything is a sacrament in Zen. Nothing's sacred because everything's sacred. So
I didn't have time to ask Brad during our interview. I asked him about the concept of evil, and dealing in the context of how people treat each other, but I didn't ask him about the concept of evil in the universe in the form of tragedy, AIDS, cancer, accidents, aging, etc. How does Zen Buddhism, what's Zen Buddhism's attitude towards this?
Okay, well, I'm going to have to back up a little bit then to the Pali Canon, the oldest Buddhist scriptures. So the Buddhist scriptures of the Theravadan Buddhists. If anyone were to read these, or even like the Dhammapada, you can see that the Buddha is clearly a dualist, not a monist. He would never have agreed that nirvana is samsara, as the later Mahayana Buddhists do, including Zen. He is so clear that they're not the same. Anyone who doubts this, they can go online and find dozens of translations of the Dhammapada It's an important scripture in Theravada. And it's not very long. Probably take you 15 minutes to read it, and you can see for yourself that Gautama, which of course he didn't really exist, but anyways, he was a dualist, not a monist. To Gautama, evil was an actual active principle of malevolence. It's not simply a lack of goodness or a moral vacuum. I've given this example before in some of my essays I've written for your site. When a little girl is kidnapped and raped and murdered, she isn't the victim of a mere moral vacuum or the flip side of good. She's the victim of evil with a capital E. Zen and the entire Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhist world would reply that suffering there is, but none who suffer. In other words, the little girl isn't ultimately real. Ultimately, she's just shunyata, the void, the emptiness. So the suffering doesn't matter. As I've written for the site, I've said that in Buddhism we have no self. There's no ghost in the machine, so to speak. The machine is the ghost. It's the emptiness, the non-materiality. The material universe is nothing more than a series of vibrations of the space-time continuum. There's really nothing here in a classical Newtonian sense of solid matter. There aren't any solid pieces. There's just the one thing, this one non-material thing vibrating away, giving an impression of solidity. The void in Zen, good and evil, are perceptual, completely perceptual. We like how light rain feels on our skin, so we call it good. Lightning hurts or kills, so we call it bad. In Zen, good and evil are just value judgments, a perception, an artifact of our cultural conditioning. There is no actual good or evil, not in any ultimate sense anyway. Evil is merely the absence of good, or the flip side of good. Everything is relative and exists only in relation to its opposite. So like a coin has two sides, the universe has two sides, light and darkness, positive and negative. And we prefer one over the other. Such ways of thinking have to be overcome in Zen because it's considered a fetter, an impediment. Yet to me, anyone who would give such glib answers in the face of real suffering, they'd quickly change their tune. And in fact, they do change their tune when it's their son or their daughter or their niece or nephew that's senselessly murdered or dies of some horrible illness. And I dare anyone listening to go up to a Zen Buddhist who's standing by the coffin of his murdered daughter and comfort him by saying, there, buck up, pal. She wasn't real anyway. Suffering there is, but none who suffer. I bet you'd be assaulted. Rightly so. I've experienced palpable evil with a capital E in people, and in entities I couldn't even see with my physical eyes. It's malevolent. It's not simply a moral vacuum or the flip side of good. Anyway, Gnosticism historically tells us that there is a ghost in the machine. We do have a self, a spirit, and it's part of the pleroma, the fullness of the Godhead. And we can return to the pleroma in the here and now, right this very moment if we choose, and ultimately at our physical death.
So basically, the original teachings of the Buddha would make him a bona fide kind of
Gnostic,
and they're like other religions, like Christianity. These teachings, these original kernel teachings, just kind of got lost, whitewashed, and so forth.
Oh yes, oh my goodness, yes. Just read the Dhammapada, and you'll see just how distorted it's become.
And you also have a problem with Zen Buddhism being almost too pantheistic, right?
Buddhism really isn't about God. That's the tragedy of Buddhism here in America. Writers like D.T. Suzuki, he's one of the most responsible ones for this. He turned Buddhism into a quest for God when he wrote books for Westerners interested in Zen. There isn't a Godhead in Buddhism. Nirvana or the Tao isn't God or a Godhead. In Theravada Buddhism, Nirvana is defined, in fact I've got it right here, Nirvana is defined as the unborn, the ungrown, the unconditioned, the uncompounded, the absolute. It's the refuge from the born, the grown, the conditioned, the compounded, the relative. And this is very much akin to the Gnostic experience of the pleroma. In Mahayana Buddhism, including Zen, nirvana is samsara. They're the same, just perceived and experienced differently. When you free yourself of value judgments and your discriminating thoughts, then you see that samsara is nirvana. If you define God really broadly to mean just the supreme reality, then yes, the universe is God in Zen. In Gnostic thought, the universe is either a self-existent eternal entity that isn't God or Godhead at all, or it's a very distant emanation of the Godhead. Gnostics look beyond the material world for a transcendent reality that truly is beyond this cosmos or any other cosmos. Zen embraces this cosmos as the supreme reality. Did that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, we are talking about two ideologies that are almost impossible to express anyway, and you, Brad, have done a very good job. So we'll just have to let the listener to decide for themselves. And rounding down, and of course, we know that meditation is the linchpin and of Zen Buddhism. It's one of the mysteries, as there are in Gnosticism, and I'm sure, like you said, it's something very trendy. But what is your advice to people who would like to engage in meditation in order to gain Gnosis?
Well, do it. It's great. Zazen isn't for everybody, but any Gnostic interested in meditation should give it a good go before they settle on something else like Siddha. I would say keep away from transcendental meditation. It's just too simple. You're not going to go very far with TM.
Okay, what exactly is transcendental meditation for the listeners?
They give you a mantra. You don't even time the mantra with your breathing, with your heartbeat, or then you just repeat it in your mind over and over. It's supposedly good for we busy Westerners. You can make some progress with it. I used it for several years. I made some progress. Then it stopped, so I moved on to Siddha. But it's just too simple. You're just not going to go very far with it. Siddha, you're going to go a lot farther. But I settled on Zazen because it took me the furthest of all. This concentrating on your breathing. Eventually, you can't quiet down your monkey mind. You can only ignore it by concentrating on your breath. But eventually, it shuts up of its own. You lose all sense of yourself. There's only a sense of you only know about your own breathing. That's all that exists is breathing. And then something else happens that I'm not going to say what. I'm just going to say if you're going to meditate, at least give Zazen a try for a few months. Let it start doing its magic. I was surprised that Brad found it boring. It's anything but boring to me. So yeah, my advice, find a Zendo near you. That's the best way to learn, is take some classes at a Zendo. You can find a Zendo near you with Google. And if you can't do that, get a book that explains how to do it. And there's even some good videos on YouTube that show the basics. Or I can be emailed at omnamaom@aol.com, and I can teach it that way. But that's not the best way. The best way is to go directly to a Zendo. You don't have to embrace the Zen philosophy to learn Zazen. You can just take classes long enough to learn it and then do it on your own. But there's so many forms of meditation, and one should try a few types before you settle on any one type. Who knows, after a few years you might outgrow whatever you're doing and have to move on. I had to move on twice before finding Zazen. So, yeah, do it. Find a form of meditation and do it.
All right, well, yeah, you heard it here. One way, and definitely a cheap way to gain Gnosis, that's for sure. Well, thanks a lot, Nate, for coming on Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis. And
thanks for having me again.
Oh, always a pleasure, my friend, and we will have you on soon.